In July of 1996, Egbert Rimkus was looking for an adventure. At 34 years old, the civil engineer from Dresden carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed he could outthink the world. His brown hair, trimmed neatly above sharp eyes, gave him an air of quiet determination. Beside him was his girlfriend, Cornelia Meyer, 27, practical and soft-spoken, who had agreed to join the trip with her young son. Egbert's own child, 10-year-old George, came along as well, shy but curious, always tugging at his father's sleeve with questions. Cornelia's boy, Max, 4 years old, was a whirlwind of restless energy, wide-eyed at every new sight. The four of them boarded a flight from Germany to the bright lights of Las Vegas, eager to experience the vast landscapes of the American West. They had rented a cheerful green Plymouth Voyager minivan, the kind of family vehicle perfect for road trips and sightseeing, and set off with maps, a few guidebooks, and far more optimism than preparation. At first, it was everything they had hoped for. They stopped at gas stations to buy sodas and candy, snapped photographs against the surreal backdrop of Nevada's desert, and joked about the heat that pressed down like an invisible hand. The children giggled in the back seat, chattering in German, while Egbert studied the maps, confident in every turn of the wheel. But somewhere along the road, between Las Vegas and the shimmering horizon of California's Death Valley, their story took a darker path. What began as a holiday would unravel into one of the most haunting mysteries in national park history. By the time investigators caught up, all that would remain was an abandoned van and a silence so complete it stretched for 13 long years. This is the story of the Death Valley Germans. Welcome to Criminal Mind Tales. Don't forget to subscribe for more haunting true crime stories that you'll never forget. The American Southwest shimmer with myth for Europeans. Monument Valley, the Grand Canyon, Death Valley, names whisper from film reels and postcards, places where land stretched so wide and empty it seemed less like geography and more like eternity exposed. That July of 1996, the Rimkus-Meyer party followed a thread of highways into California, into the land the Mojave had hardened into salt and stone. Egbert's travel notes, found years later, were tidy in German script. Reservations, mile markers, campground lists. But the neatness on paper masked the impulsiveness of the man himself. He had a habit of chasing possibilities the way others chase shade in the desert, always one step further than necessary, always 1 degree hotter than safe. They checked into Furnace Creek Ranch, the kind of oasis where palm trees tremble against blue sky and swimming pools reflect unbearable heat. Here the air felt less like wind and more like something you had to push through with your whole body. The official thermometer ticked toward 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Even the horizon looked molten, mirages shimmering like restless ghosts. Cornelia pressed her hand to George's head, damp with sweat, and asked if this was wise. She preferred structure, certainty. A hike here, a drive there, returned to the room by dusk. But Egbert was already unfolding maps across the motel bedspread, tracing red lines with his finger into country not meant for rental vans or children. He saw shortcuts where others saw dead ends. The family made small pilgrimages those first days. Badwater Basin, lowest point in North America, a white expanse of salt that burned the eyes. Artist's Palette, where Mineral Street hills rose in impossible colors. Tourists snapped pictures and retreated to air-conditioned cars. But Egbert lingered, searching the horizon as if waiting for something to reveal itself. By the evening of July 22nd, they were restless. The official plan was to head west toward Yosemite in the coming days, but Egbert had one more detour in mind. A route scrawled on his map promised a faster crossing of the valley. It was a road barely marked, unpaved, threading through ghost towns and empty basins. To Egbert it looked like efficiency. To Cornelia it looked like erasure of gas stations, of water, of safety. That night, after the children were asleep, they argued quietly on the porch of their motel room. The cicadas buzzed. Heat radiated off the walls like the breath of an oven. Cornelia's voice was low, insistent. The children, the car, the distance. Egbert's was sharp, edged with stubbornness. In the end, he folded the map and tucked it into his shirt pocket. Decision made. No one knew what they packed the next morning or how carefully. Years later, When the van was found, its contents offered clues, but not the whole picture. Empty water jugs, scattered food wrappers, children's toys. They left Furnace Creek, as if nothing was amiss, another family on holiday. But the desert remembers. They drove past the last gas station, past the last store, into country where roads buckled under heat and signs grew fewer, into a silence vast enough to bury four voices in an instant. Tourists turned back at the sight of endless gravel. The Germans pressed forward. When the sun climbed higher, bleaching the sky to white, their tracks began to blur in the sand. By the time the desert swallowed them whole, it was too late for anyone to notice. And so it began, a journey that would end not in photograph and memories, but in bones scattered across a forgotten wash, children's fates untold, and a question that would echo through the desert for decades. Why did they leave the road? The road that wasn't meant to be a road began as a thin, pale scar against the desert floor. To the untrained eye, it looked more like the trace of a storm wash or an animal path than something to drive upon. But on Egbert Rimkes's map, folded and refolded so often the creases were white as bone, it promised a direct path, a daring diagonal that cut across Death Valley like a whispered secret. Cornelia had studied the same map the night before. She saw the shaded topography, the jagged ridgelines, the vast stretches of emptiness where no gas pump or ranger station stood. She'd placed her finger on the wide, safe artery of Highway 190, the road every sensible traveler used to cross the valley. Here, she had said, but Egbert's finger had slid south, to the dotted line that threaded through names that sounded more like warnings and destinations. Warm Springs, Butte Valley, Anvil Canyon. The family's Plymouth Voyager rattled as its tires left the comfort of asphalt and bit into gravel. The sun was merciless, already high, its glare bouncing off the windshield like fire. Inside, the air conditioner whined under the strain, barely holding back the desert's assault. Max stared out the window, his face pressed against the glass, watching the landscape shift from salt flat to rolling badlands. George, too young to understand risk, clutched his toy truck and sang to himself, content. Egbert leaned forward, knuckles tight on the steering wheel. This was adventure. This was authenticity. This was the story he wanted to tell when they returned home. That while others stayed on safe highways, he had taken his family into the true heart of America's wilderness. Cornelia's unease thickened with every mile. The road narrowed, then fractured into spidery branches. The Voyager lurched over rocks, its tires sending up plumes of dust that hung in the air like smoke. Signs vanished. Shade vanished. Only the endless mirage shimmered ahead, promising water that would never be reached. When they stopped for lunch, the silence pressing like a weight. Egbert spread out bread and fruit on the hood of the car, sweat dripping into his eyes. Cornelia barely ate, scanning the horizon instead. The stillness of the desert unnerved her. It wasn't quiet, not really. It was alive with a hiss of heat, the faint rattle of unseen creatures, the distant thrum of blood in her own ears. She tried again. We should turn back. Egbert's reply was swift, dismissive. The map shows the road connects. It's shorter. We'll be through by evening. But the desert doesn't measure distance in miles. It measures in endurance, in gallons of water, in luck. And the Germans had entered a place where luck was rarely kind. By mid-afternoon, the Voyager's tires were biting into softer ground. Egbert steered sharply, the wheel heavy in his hands, until the road gave way to a dry wash, a corridor carved by flash floods that hadn't run in years. The wash looked drivable, wide and inviting. It was a trap. Sand gripped the tires like a predator. The minivan shuddered, slowed, then lurched forward again, groaning in protest. Egbert pressed harder on the accelerator. The wheels spun, throwing up fountains of grit. Rubber burned. The Voyager crawled another 20 yards before sinking, the undercarriage scraping against stone. He tried reverse. The tires shrieked, dug deeper. Cornelia's voice rose in panic, sharp and clipped in German. Max shifted uneasily in the back seat, George now wide-eyed and silent. The desert stood indifferent as the engine howled, as Egbert cursed and rocked the van. Forward, backward, forward again. At last the Voyager staggered free, but at a cost. The left rear tire shredded against the rocks, rubber flapping like torn skin. They limped onward. The road, if it could still be called that, narrowed further. The van rattled violently, its suspension moaning. Another tire failed. Then another. Egbert pressed on, desperate, stubborn. Metal rims sparked against stone. When the Voyager finally wheezed to a halt for the last time, it was in the middle of nowhere, no water, no shade, no sign of human life. For souls stranded in the hottest desert on the continent, with only what they carried. That van would wait 13 years to be found, sun-bleached and sand-choked, sitting like a tombstone in Anvil Canyon. But in that moment, in July of 1996, the Germans were still alive. The desert had not yet taken them. They stepped out into the heat, blinking against the glare, children clutching their parents' hands, their shadows already beginning to fade against the sand. What choices they made next, what desperate paths they followed, what calculations Egbert scrawled in his notebook, what Cornelia whispered to soothe the children. Those choices would vanish as surely as their footprints. All the world would see, years later, was a van, alone and silent, its doors hanging open like the mouth of a creature that had consumed its passengers whole. 13 years later, the desert gave up its first clue. It was October 2009 when a pair of searchers, veterans of the Death Valley German mystery, crept into Anvil Canyon with persistence of men chasing ghosts. The case had grown cold, filed away as just another entry in the long catalog of disappearances swallowed by the Mojave. But not for them. They had returned again and again, haunted by the thought that something still waited to be found. And then, like a mirage finally solidifying into fact, they saw it. A pale, sun-bleached van crouched in the canyon, half buried in sand, its tires long since chewed to ribbons, its frame sagging as if exhausted by the years. The Plymouth Voyager sat at a tilt, one wheel sunk, one door ajar, a hollow carcass beneath the pitiless sky. It was the kind of sight that froze the blood, because no vehicle gets here by accident. Inside, the air was stifling even after sunset, the kind of heat that clings like a hand around the throat. Dust lay thick across the dashboard, undisturbed for over a decade. The upholstery had split, foam stuffing spilling like innards. Scattered across the floor were remnants of a vanished journey. Children's toys warped by sun, food wrappers crumbling to powder, empty water containers. The van told a story, but not the whole one. Investigators pieced together what they could. The Voyager had been driven on shredded tires for miles, its rims scarred and bent from grinding against stone. Egbert, it seemed, had been unwilling to stop, unwilling to admit defeat until metal protested louder than rubber. They had pressed on deeper into Anvil Canyon, beyond where logic would advise, until the desert itself pulled them to a halt. There was no blood, no signs of violence, no final note left behind, only the silence of a machine abandoned, baking year after year beneath the gaze of indifferent mountains. What chilled investigators most was not the van itself, but the absence around it. No human remains lay nearby, no tracks preserved by luck or miracle, nothing to suggest which direction the family had gone or why. The desert had erased them with brutal efficiency, and yet the Voyager was an anchor, a beginning. For all those years, the Germans had been a rumor, a question mark, a whisper traded among desert rangers and German newspapers. But here was proof. They had been here. They had stood on this very ground. They had opened that sliding door, stepped into the heat, and carried their children away from the only shade they had. The van became a shrine. Tourists whispered when they saw the photographs, chilled by the thought of a family walking away into that furnace. Rangers shuddered at the idea of two children led into such hopelessness. And those who searched knew, with growing certainty, that somewhere beyond the spot lay the rest of the story. Bones, scattered belongings, perhaps even a journal that could explain the unexplainable. Still, the Voyager had its own voice. The shredded tires were a scream of defiance, of a man trying to outdrive the inevitable. The abandoned toys were whispers of innocence, echoes of a journey that should have ended with postcards and photographs, not a tomb of rust and silence. Standing there in 2009, the searchers realized the desert had kept its promise. It had hidden, but not forever. The van was not the end of the mystery. It was the beginning of its unraveling. What happened to the Germans after they stepped out of that vehicle would remain hidden for only a little longer. For now, the Voyager sat like a sentinel, waiting for the wind to tell the rest. And somewhere out in the labyrinth of washes and ridges, bones were waiting. They left the van because they had no choice. At first, the Plymouth Voyager had seemed like shelter, thin metal walls shielding them from a sun that blazed without mercy. But inside, the air grew unbearable, thick with heat that turned each breath into a gasp. The vehicle was a coffin waiting to be sealed. To stay meant death. To leave meant chance. So Egbert gathered what he could. Empty water jugs rattled uselessly. The little that remained sloshed in at the bottom of a single container. Food was crumbs. A notebook, maps, a compass. Cornelia bundled George against her hip, while Max, already exhausted, trudged at her side. The desert opened before them like a furnace with no door. Sand slipped beneath their shoes, every step heavy, clumsy. Heat shimmered in waves, turning the horizon into a trickster. A pool of water here, a patch of shade there, always vanishing as they approached. The canyon walls hemmed them in, towering slabs of stone that radiated stored heat back upon them, doubling their torment. Egbert kept his eyes forward, jaw set. He told Cornelia it was only a few miles, that warm springs lay ahead, that they would find help. But the truth pressed heavy against the back of his mind. His calculations were guesses, his optimism a fragile shield against despair. The sun bore down. By midday, George's babble had quieted into whimpers. Cornelia shifted him from hip to shoulder, her own skin blistering. Max stumbled, lips cracked, eyes glassy. Egbert urged him on, voice sharp with fear disguised as command. We keep moving. We have to. But every step drained them further. Their shadows grew shorter, then longer again, stretched thin against the ground. The desert was not a place of forgiveness. It was a place of trial, and they were failing. When they stopped to rest, the silence was total. Not a bird, not an insect, only the faint hiss of wind over stone. The children's shallow breaths seemed louder than the world itself. Egbert scribbled in his notebook. Distances, bearings, fragments of hope. Years later, those notes would be discovered cryptic, desperate. But in that moment, they were all he had, numbers against the infinite. Cornelia touched his arm. They can't go on much longer. Her voice cracked, both from thirst and fear. Egbert's eyes burned, not just from the sun, but from the weight of responsibility. He had led them here. He had insisted on the shortcut. And now, with every mile, he could feel the valley claiming them. They pressed forward into the twilight hours, when the heat gave way to a bitter chill that gnawed at their weakened bodies. The desert gave no comfort, only another face of its cruelty. George cried softly, then slept against Cornelia's chest, his little body limp with exhaustion. Max tripped, scraped his hands against stone, but rose again silent, his determination frightening in its frailty. That night, they huddled together beneath the indifferent stars. The sky blazed with constellations so sharp they seemed within reach, a cruel contrast to the emptiness below. Egbert wrapped his arms around Cornelia and the children, whispering promises he could not keep. In the darkness, coyotes called. Rocks shifted with the cooling air. The desert listened, patient. By morning, they would rise again and walk. And again the next day. And again, until the canyon swallowed their footprints, until their voices faded, until the line between survival and surrender blurred into nothing. Death Valley does not take quickly. It lingers. It whispers. It watches its prey exhaust every hope before it finally closes its hand. And in July of 1996, for Germans, alone and desperate, walked deeper into its grasp. By late July of 1996, the Rimkus-Meyer party had already slipped into oblivion. Yet in Germany, no alarm had been raised. Travelers are expected to go quiet for days, even weeks, especially in a country as vast as America. Postcards arrive late. Phone calls are missed. Itineraries blur. For a time, their absence was simply that, absence. It was not until their return flight came and went, unboarded, that questions began to form. Families called the airline. Calls turned to embassies. The German consul in Los Angeles, accustomed to frantic inquiries from abroad, logged the report. A man, his partner, and 2 boys had vanished somewhere between Las Vegas and Yosemite. The timing was already against them. The trail, whatever faint footprints had remained, was weeks cold. Search efforts began with maps and guesswork. The Germans had rented a Chrysler Plymouth Voyager from Dollar Rent-A-Car in Los Angeles. Rental records provided dates, but no destinations. Credit card charges placed them in Las Vegas, then Furnace Creek. After that, the line went dead. Rangers swept Death Valley's popular sites: Badwater Basin, Zabriskie Point, Furnace Creek Campground. Tourists recalled nothing unusual: no frantic family, no abandoned vehicle. Flyers went up at trailheads and gas stations. Helicopters scanned the desert for a gleam of glass, a glint of metal. But the searchers looked where the living would be, not where the dead were waiting. The desert mocked them with its immensity. Death Valley covers over 3 million acres, more than some European countries. Its canyons twist into mazes. Its dry washes erase footprints in hours. To find a single van, let alone 4 human beings, was like hunting shadows on the surface of the sun. Still, there were moments when discovery seemed close. Pilots reported a faint dust trail in the Panamint Range, but by the time ground teams arrived, the wind had scrubbed it clean. Bloodhounds were deployed in the lower valley but wilted in the heat, noses overwhelmed by nothing but dry stone and salt. Worse still, communication faltered. German authorities pressed for action. American rangers juggled scarce resources, and in the gaps between, days slipped into weeks. Each missed opportunity grew heavier in hindsight. Each wrong turned more damning. Back in Germany, newspapers began to stir. The missing tourists were not just names. They were photographs. Egbert's angular face, Cornelia's gentle smile, Max's boyish grin, George's cherubic cheeks. Readers who had never heard of Death Valley before now whispered its name like a curse. Parents clutched their children closer at night. Conspiracy theories bloomed as the weeks dragged on. Some whispered of foul play, of robbery on lonely highways. Others spoke of cults in the desert, of hidden bunkers and kidnappings. But the truth, crueler than speculation, was simpler. The Germans had wandered into a landscape vast enough to erase them. By August, the official search dwindled. Rangers had scoured the areas most likely to hold answers and found nothing. Without new leads, they were forced to retreat, to let the desert keep its silence. Files were closed. Reports were shelved. The Germans were declared missing, presumed lost. But the desert remembers. For 13 years, the van sat waiting in Anvil Canyon. For 13 years, the family's bones lay scattered unseen across ridges and washes. Searchers had flown within miles, perhaps within sight, of the Voyager and passed on unaware. The cruelest twist was that they had been close, unbearably close. It was only later, in the hindsight discovery, that rangers admitted the truth. Death Valley had not needed to work hard to hide them. All it had needed was a little time, a little heat, and the world's willingness to look in the wrong direction. And so, in the summer of 1996, while 4 Germans fought desperately for survival, the world that could have saved them searched elsewhere. The silence of the valley deepened, sealing their fate. After the summer of 1996, the desert swallowed the Rimkus-Meyer family whole. The official search was called off. The files were archived and the headlines faded. But the absence remained. For the families in Dresden and Chemnitz, there were no graves to visit, no markers to lay flowers on. Their loved ones were simply gone, their last known moments a rental agreement, and a few snapshots from Las Vegas. Birthdays passed uncelebrated. Anniversaries came and went. Children who had once played alongside Max and George grew older, but the boys remained frozen in time, forever 9 and 11 in fading photographs. In America, Death Valley moved on as it always had. Tourists drove through in air-conditioned comfort, stopping for photographs at Zabriskie Point, unaware that somewhere beyond the asphalt lay the bones of 4 travelers who had once done the same. Rangers patrolled. Storms swept through. Flash floods carved new scars into the land. But the desert, vast and indifferent, kept it secret. Still, the story refused to die entirely. It lingered in the corners of travel forums and guidebooks, whispered as a cautionary tale. The Germans who vanished. Some hikers insisted they had found evidence: a shoe print, a scrap of fabric, a sun-bleached bone. Each rumor sparked brief hope, but nothing ever materialized. Occasionally, journalists returned to the case. A few inches of column space, a reminder of a mystery. Family lost in Death Valley still missing. The headlines would say, always accompanied by the same photographs, always with the same conclusion, no trace. For law enforcement, the file gathered dust. With no van, no bodies, and no crime, there was nothing to pursue. They could not prove the family was dead, only that they had disappeared. Officially, they were missing. Unofficially, they were ghosts. And yet, not everyone let go. A handful of desert wanderers, amateur sleuths, and former rangers kept the case alive in their minds. They would spread out maps of Death Valley on their kitchen tables, trace the roads, and speculate about where the van might have gone. Some walked miles of remote canyon, convinced they would stumble across the answer. But the desert always won. Meanwhile, the Rimkes-Meyer family's loved ones endured a slower kind of erosion. At first, there were calls to the consulate, requests for updates, letters to newspapers. Over the years, these dwindled. The silence from Death Valley was unbroken, and silence is heavy. Families who once demanded answers grew weary. What more could be said? By the early 2000s, the disappearance had become less of a headline and more of a ghost story told in the hushed spaces of memory. Travelers would speak of it when they passed through Furnace Creek. Did you hear about the Germans? Some said they had been killed by bandits. Others claimed they had staged their disappearance to begin a new life. A few believed the desert had taken them for good. And then, in 2009, 13 years later, the silence finally cracked. A hiker wandering far off the beaten path stumbled across something pale against the dark earth, a bone, unmistakably human. Nearby, scattered across the ridges and washes, lay more. Death Valley had kept its secret for over a decade. Now, it had begun to give it back. It was late summer 2009 when Death Valley stirred. The desert had been silent for 13 years, holding fast to its secrets, when a pair of hikers stumbled upon what looked like nothing more than sun-bleached driftwood lying in the sand. But driftwood does not lie in the canyons of Death Valley. And when the man crouched down, brushing grit from the pale surface, his stomach turned. It wasn't wood at all. It was bone. The hikers stood frozen in the empty silence. There were no roads nearby, no trails, no markers of civilization, only the wind pushing against the canyon walls. The bone was long, unmistakably human, its edges polished by time and exposure. Scattered around it were smaller fragments, half buried by shifting sand. One of them remembered the old story, half whispered in ranger stations and tourist cafes. The Germans who vanished. When the call went through to Inyo County authorities, it carried a charge of disbelief. For years, the files had sat dormant, the names familiar only to veteran rangers who had long since resigned themselves to never knowing. But now, with coordinates and a shaky description, teams mobilized again. Search crews returned to the desert, following the hikers' directions. Helicopters swept low over arroyos, while boots crunched over jagged terrain that had likely not seen a human footprint in decades. And there, in a wash carved by storms, they found them. Scattered bones, fragments of clothing, and the slow, terrible confirmation that the Rimkes-Meyer family had not simply disappeared. They had died here, in the heart of the wilderness. Among the remains were personal effects, shreds of fabric, a few metal buckles, the skeletal outlines of what had once been lives full of promise. Time and weather had reduced the scene to fragments, a puzzle missing too many pieces. Forensic teams moved carefully, mapping every shard of bone, every scattered debris. They knew the desert would never yield a complete picture, but the mere fact that the silence had broken was enough. As the sun dipped low over the Black Mountains, investigators carried the remains out of the wash. News spread quickly, jumping from local papers to German headlines. Missing tourists found after 13 years. Families who had lived with absence now faced the grim confirmation of death. Yet even amid the discovery, one chilling truth remained. Of the four who had vanished, only two could be accounted for with certainty. The bones belonged to Egbert Rimkes and Cornelia Meyer. The children, Max and George, were nowhere to be found. The silence had cracked open, but the desert was still holding something back. The bones told only part of the story. Egbert Rimkes and Cornelia Meyer had been reduced to fragments scattered across a barren wash, identified through painstaking forensic work. But when the searchers scoured the ridges, gullies, and arroyos for more, they found nothing that could be conclusively tied to Max and George. It was as if the desert had swallowed the boys whole. For investigators, this absence was as haunting as the discovery itself. Children do not simply vanish without a trace, not in pairs, not in the same inhospitable terrain where their parents had collapsed. And yet, after 13 years, no small bones, no teeth, no scraps of clothing emerged. The desert had given back the parents, but kept the children. Speculation grew immediately. Some suggested that the boys' remains were simply missed, scattered farther afield by floods, or reduced to dust by the merciless cycle of heat, wind, and erosion. Death Valley is vast, and even a thorough search can leave secrets buried in the shifting earth. But others whispered darker possibilities. Had the boys managed to walk farther than the adults, only to die beyond the sweep of the search? Were their bones lie in some uncharted canyon, waiting for another hiker to stumble across them decades later? Or, and this was a question that fueled late-night speculation on message boards, had someone else found them first? Theories multiplied. Some believed the children might have been rescued by an unknown traveler, taken in and hidden away, their identities erased. A fantasy, perhaps, but one fueled by desperation and the human refusal to accept the finality of death without proof. Others suggested foul play, the Chan encounter with a stranger in one of the most remote corners of the country. Yet no evidence pointed to this. For the families back in Germany, the absence was crueler than a grave. To know that the adults had perished was tragic, but to be left with the unanswered question of the boys' fate was unbearable. Parents of the missing often say that absence is worse than death, for it leaves the mind circling endlessly, inventing possibilities, refusing closure. In the desert, searchers pressed on for weeks after the discovery in 2009. Helicopters traced grids in the sky. Teams combed mile after mile of wilderness. They found more fragments belonging to Rimkus and Meyer, but never to the children. Every day the trail grew colder. Every hour the silence deepened. At last, the search was scaled back again. The case shifted from tragedy to enigma, a wound that would never close cleanly. Death Valley, that land of sun and silence, had revealed just enough to remind the world of its cruelty, and withheld the rest as if to say, "Some secrets are mine alone." In the aftermath of the 2009 discovery, the world returned to mystery like moths to a flame. The silence had broken, but the story was still unfinished. What really happened to the Death Valley Germans? The simplest theory was also the most likely: survival miscalculation. Egbert Rimkus, determined to take a shortcut through the desert, had driven a van into impossible terrain until the tires shredded. Stranded, the family set out on foot in one of the hottest places on earth, woefully unprepared. The adults collapsed first, exhausted and dehydrated. The children may have staggered farther, only to succumb beyond the area that was searched. This was a conclusion most investigators leaned toward, a tragedy born not of malice, but of hubris and desperation. Yet simplicity rarely satisfies. Other theories emerged, filling the void left by unanswered questions. Some pointed to condition of the van, driven recklessly off-road, tires destroyed, yet abandoned in a way that felt purposeful, almost staged. Why had Rimkus chosen that path when safer routes existed? Why push so far into nowhere? To some, it suggested not miscalculation, but intent, a man bent on proving something, or perhaps running from more than the desert. And then there were the darker suspicions. Could they have crossed paths with someone in the emptiness? Death Valley, after all, has a long history of shadows. Prospectors, drifters, fugitives. A single encounter with the wrong stranger could have rewritten the family's fate. Supporters of this theory whispered about the missing boys. If foul play had been involved, perhaps the children had been taken. No evidence supported it, but the absence of their remains fanned the flames of speculation. Another theory circled the search itself. In 1996, teams had scoured the area but found nothing. How could such a thorough effort miss remains lying only miles from the van? Had the family wandered far later than investigators thought? Had shifting floods and storms buried the evidence until time exposed it again? Or, most unsettling of all, had the bones been there all along, overlooked in the vast, merciless landscape? Theories spread like wildfire online. Amateur sleuths mapped routes on Google Earth, argued over survival timelines, dissected every scrap of evidence. Some insisted Rimkus had been reckless, dragging his girlfriend and the children into disaster. Others believed he was desperate, a man behind on child support in Germany, seeking escape, perhaps even intending never to return. But the shadows only deepened the mystery. Each theory answered one question, while raising two more. Why were the adults' bones found together while the boys remained missing? Why did the van sit undisturbed for months before being discovered, when its tracks should have been fresh? Why did Death Valley, a place that yields nothing easily, give back only part of the story? In the end, none of the theories fit cleanly. Each left jagged edges, unresolved pieces, haunting silences. And maybe that was the truest theory of all, that the desert had claimed them not out of reason, but out of indifference. Death Valley does not deal in neat endings. It deals in shadows and secrets in stories half told. For the families in Germany, the news in 2009 brought no comfort. Yes, bones have been found. Yes, forensic science confirmed what they had feared since the summer of 1996. Egbert Rimkus and Cornelia Meyer were dead. But confirmation is not closure. And the absence of Max and George loomed like a shadow over every conversation, every headline, every condolence card. How does one mourn half a truth? Parents buried photographs instead of bodies. Birthdays were marked in silence, not celebration. Friends avoided asking because there was no answer that could ease the weight. For 13 years, they had lived in limbo, and the discovery did not end it. It only deepened the wound, offering proof of tragedy without the peace of resolution. In Dresden, Egbert's relatives tried to piece together his final days. They studied maps of Death Valley, tracing routes with trembling fingers, trying to imagine the desperation that had driven him deeper into the wilderness. In Chemnitz, Cornelia's family lit candles in her memory, whispering prayers for the children who remained unaccounted for. Their absence was a second death, harder than the first. Not knowing what had fallen, not knowing if they had clung to each other in those final moments, not knowing at all. For the German press, the case became a story of caution, a parable of arrogance in the face of nature's cruelty. For the families, it was something far more intimate, a daily ache, a reminder that grief without answers is a cage that never opens. And what of the boys? Were they lying even now in some unmarked arroyo, their bones scattered beyond reach? Had they staggered farther than the adults, small bodies carrying impossible hope through the desert until the silence claimed them? Or, and this was the whisper that haunted the mothers most, had something else happened, something no search team or map could explain? The questions were endless, and with every year that passed, they grew heavier. Back in Death Valley, tourists continued to arrive. They stood at Furnace Creek, fanning themselves against the dry heat, snapping photographs against the endless horizon. They did not know or did not care that somewhere in the ridges and washes lay the remnants of a story that had stolen years from grieving families across the ocean. The desert offered no apology. It never does. And so the case of the Death Valley Germans rests where it began, in silence, a silence that the families carry with them, an absence that no discovery can ever fill. Because Death Valley does not give back everything. It gives back just enough to remind the living of what it has taken.